Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back. And as Mlondi was saying before we started, today has been, it's a very Monday-ish Monday. It didn't even give you that sort of easing into the work vibe. It was just...
Yeah. And we're also very happy to have back on the show after a bit of an absence, Mlondi Mdluli. Mlondi, how are you doing? How is your Monday?
Good afternoon, Nick, and good afternoon, Herman. I'm doing absolutely well. It's a pleasure to be back and ready to rock and roll.
Exactly.
This type of
those enthusiastic birds.
Yeah, well, I was just about to complain about this level of enthusiasm on a Monday. This is HR is here about this.
Yeah, I'm back with a bang.
All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the launch of the Rise Mzansi Manifesto, the curious problem of doctors in South Africa not being able to find work, and lastly, we're going to finish off with a little bit of discussion about the frustrating water bill, yet another one of government's silly schemes that are going to make things worse for people. But let's start off with the Rise Mzansi Manifesto launch. So Rise Mzansi, there's been a bit of buzz about it. It's a new political party. Songezo Zibi is its most prominent figure, who seems to be the face of the party for the most part. And over the weekend, his party revealed its manifesto for some of the things it was going to do to tackle problems in South Africa. Now, they said that crime, hunger, load shedding, water shortages, lack of job opportunities, and lack of investment were some of the main areas they wanted to tackle, which I think sounds very reasonable. This is not, unfortunately, they're often, political parties get caught up in some sort of overly symbolic, emotional issue, but I think these are some good ones to focus on. During their manifesto launch, they said, quote, given the prevalence of food insecurity and hunger, Rise Mzansi government will use a combination of state income grants and food discount vouchers for grant recipients, increasing access to pipe water in rural areas, providing people with land for own food production and small-scale farming to improve food security. They also talked a little bit about how they're going to end cadre deployment, as they believe that has eroded the efficiency of the government services. Rise Mzansi says they would speed up the redistribution of land, but would use lawful expropriation to get it done. I'm not entirely sure what they consider lawful expropriation. He said that Songezo Zibi said that the bullying behavior of blue light brigades would be stopped. He talked about cracking down on corruption, drug abuse. Said that new city and rural planning will provide for a mix of government housing and service stands for those who can afford to build. Will also provide for green zones that include stock and crop farming for our own commercial food production. So there's a couple of ideas I think here that are worth talking about. It seems not too terrible. I think it seems what one would expect from a party that's kind of views itself, I think, as a bit of a center-left party. Nothing here about affirmative action as far as I'm aware. But Herman, what do you make of this manifesto? What do you make of the prospects of Rise Mzansi? I've actually seen in Joburg quite a few posters for them, but I still think the party has yet to kind of break out from the pack into the media space in a big way. I don't think they've featured in any polling that I've seen so far. Well, what do you make of their manifesto and where their prospects are at the moment?
Yeah, I must say it was a welcome read, the manifesto in general. I think it identifies the issues quite aptly. I was especially sort of pleased to see malnutrition as something that they put on the radar. I think that is a vastly underappreciated issue within South African poverty. And it is, it plays such a key role in terms of the development of South Africans into value-add economic participants, that I think it is a very useful focus to add. However, reading this all through, I couldn't help but feel this sounded somewhat familiar, and I couldn't quite place why until I realized this is what 2017 Cyril Ramaphosa sounded like, almost exactly. Almost exactly. If you leave the cadre deployment shade being thrown out of the equation, this is vintage Cyril 2017, even vintage Cyril 2018. And of all the stuff within the manifesto that I find, I mean, all manifestos sort of run into the tedium of rhetoric with no practical implications and practical solutions of exactly how.
Right. It doesn't matter what party it is. A manifesto always ends up being a little bit like, we're in favor of good things and against bad things.
Exactly. And the best thing to look at then becomes two questions for assessing a manifesto. Number one is, what can you deduce about the values of this party? Not what it says about its values, but what can you find underlying its policy promises? Because whether it can enact those or has plans to enact those, it does tell you something about the underlying value assumptions of a party. And then the second thing that you can look for is what legislative frameworks and powers need to be in place for this manifesto to even stand a chance of delivering what it contains. And what worries me most about the Rise Mzansi question is, underlying most of what they say is the assumption of the legality, constitutionality, and moral acceptableness of race-based policies. In one of the points on page, where was it? On page 38, bullet point number 2. And they say, we will use government procurement to provide preferential access for genuinely Black and women-owned companies. How? I mean, will they be? Do they have a plan for pencil testing? Do they have plans to bring back the Population Registration Act of 1950 or 1952? I can't remember, that classified when someone is white and when someone is Black and when someone is colored. The underlying assumption of this entire manifesto is that the ideology that has been in power is broadly fine. Except cadre deployment, that's bad. But for the rest, government is good. Government intervention is good. So it's Cyril 2017 on that. It's against cadre deployment, which is fantastic, but it isn't against the processes that work with cadre deployment to hollow out the state as a set of skills. And that is race-based appointments. It's no accident that 85% of Black South Africans have seen no tangible benefit from BEE, but that the numbers of ANC millionaires are at all-time highs. So you can get rid of cadre deployment. Well done. That's part of the problem. But in your manifesto, you say we want to have skilled people in the right jobs. But how? How will you determine those skills? You're not willing to get rid of other non-meritorious-based decision-making mechanisms like BEE. In fact, you lean heavily into it throughout your manifesto. So we have to conclude that at the basis of your value foundation is race-based policies of the nature of the ANC, the ideology that the state can, through regulatory frameworks and more strenuous adherence to such frameworks, fix the problems that the state has caused. And thirdly, that you fundamentally need the underlying legislative framework that tells you, like the apartheid government did, when you are Black enough to, in the words of Rise Mzansi, be genuinely Black.
There's also another line, I think it's on page, 16, about we will stop the corrupt abuse of BEE. It's kind of, as you say, Herman, it's sort of it's a feature actually of the system. You can't really get rid of, you can't really keep BEE and then just say, well, but there's going to be no corrupt. The moment you introduce these elements.
It is quite, I've always found this a bit insulting. If you say we're going to appoint the best based on race. So is the implication there is that the best and being Black is somehow in tension. I mean, that's a fundamentally racist assumption. Steve Biko will be, having a heart attack with this inferiority idea that Black South Africans somehow can't compete on the basis of merit. I mean, it's sort of really,
No, I agree. So that's definitely a problem, I think, with this manifesto stuff that they put up. But that being said, there are definitely, I think, some things here in which they have strayed a little bit away from the ANC approach to things. Talking about investment is, as you say, some people in the ANC have kicked it around before, but it's never really been like a serious ANC plank in their election manifesto. And in fact, when you see them talk about, in any setting, it's always like capital this and business evil that and blah, 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 blah. So there's at least a toning down of that kind of rhetoric. I also like the stuff about providing stands for people who are willing to build. I think that may even still be a DA policy, but that is an attempt to get away from having to build an RDP house for absolutely everyone in the country and saying to some people, it is trusting people to actually be able to do their own thing. You say, look, if you don't want to wait for the RDP house, which is going to take 5 years, here's a plot of land, here's some water pipes to it and an electricity connection point. Do whatever you want, build your house. That's good. And I think that's a step forward.
The problem with that is that baked into that are a few fundamental solutions that the Rise Mzansi manifesto actually makes even more difficult by being unable to address the elephants in the room. Number one, right. It wants to legally expropriate without compensation. So the land it wants to give away might actually be, it wants to strengthen property rights while at the same time attacking property yes. rights, but doing so in a way that is, covered in legalese. But then the second problem is RDP housing, the fact that South Africans can't really own them as assets. Yes, that's part of the problem. Yeah. But you know what's also part of the problem is the entire process that is rigged by stuff like preferential procurement, cadre deployment, BEE, the entire process. I mean, fine, give them land, but number one, was that land given as property to someone because it was taken as property from someone else, in which case property rights really doesn't mean anything. And then number two, what will it look like if you don't address stuff like BEE and the preferential procurement framework that is currently baking corruption into these engagements that South Africans have with the state?
So Mlondi, let me come to you. Firstly, just your overall thoughts on what you think are Rise Mzansi's chances in general, and secondly, just I don't know if you have any thoughts on this discussion that Hermann and I are having about the sort of there's this the manifesto pulling in two different directions that kind of the center can't really hold. I don't know. What do you think about all this?
Yes, so I'll start with my prediction. Well, it's it's always hard to start a new party, from scratch, and it's gonna be like a difficult task. So so to expect them to get maybe 5% of the votes is asking too much. But I do expect them to win some vote, but I don't see it being that significant. And yeah, but I mean they seem to be doing well. They seem to be getting all the work, on the ground up and running. Like we see their posters on the road. And their and their leader is all like he's on TV talking sometimes to talk about the views of the party and what the and what the party has to offer. So I think that's good. But on your second question about about the party's policies, I would say that some of them are good. However, some of them sort of lean towards the ANC. For example, saying that they're gonna remove cadre deployments, as Hermann said, is good. But I mean, what about BEE, which is a component of cadre a deployment. So those are some concerns that I have. Maybe the party can clear that up, but yeah, it's still the policies are good, but they need some revision in my opinion. But I'm sure that they'll get some votes here and there, but it wouldn't be significant.
Right, and this I think does create, because I think Rise Mzansi would probably be quite happy in a coalition government. Let's say the ANC and EFF together do very badly in the next election. Let's just put out a number that I don't think is realistic, but let's say they get 35%, EFF gets 10%, and then they're not able to form a coalition in national government. And I think Rise Mzansi would be pretty happy to fit into the opposition coalition, with the DA being the biggest party and then all these other parties like the IFP and Action SA and all that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the rubber is going to have to meet the road in that coalition. When you come to a question of, well, are we going to get rid of BEE and preferential procurement? And I think that's going to be a very big challenge for any opposition coalition is that these are fundamental to the problems in the country. And yet they're not being, there's still this kind of belief that BEE can be saved. I don't
Yeah,
know. It
true.
doesn't really seem like that to me.
Unfortunately. Yeah,
Um,
true. Same. I agree with you.
Herman, any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, no, I do think we're at risk. South Africans have been at risk for 20 years of learning the wrong lessons from probably the two most successful coalition governments in our history, the Government of National Unity and the Cape Town municipal government of 2006 to 2009. Something that you must remember specifically about the 2006 to 2009, well, actually a bit longer, but that was the mayoralty of Helen Zille. Something that people must remember about the coalition, the opposition coalition that took over Cape Town in 2006, was that there was less empty ideological space between the parties that ultimately formed that coalition. You could, if you're going to be on the ideological spectrum of left to right, you could position the parties that form that coalition, and you will be able to, for every slot between just left of center to relatively right center, you will be able to slot in a party that covers that ideological space. So the coalition could operate at local government level that isn't particularly known for being an ideological level of government. It very much more is the meat and potatoes of getting the bins handled on time. But it is crucial to make sure that there isn't a disconnect, an ideological disconnect on something as important as property rights or BEE. Baked into the idea of BEE is that race-based discrimination is fine. That is a fundamental problem for, I think, the ACDP, the Freedom Front Plus, and parts of the DA. So the moment you're going to have BEE as a point of contention, it's going to, perhaps not in the first year or second year of a coalition, but at some point, the question of is race-based discrimination fine is going to come to the fore, and it's going to be a point of tension. These things can be skirted around at local government level, because local government level is really the meat and potatoes, basic stuff. It isn't heavy on ideology. I mean, the biggest ideological challenge usually at local government level is insourcing versus outsourcing. That's about the scope of ideological clash at local government. When it comes to provincial government, national government, it's a different story. And Rise Mzansi doesn't seem to me to be able to cozily fit into an anti-ANC multi-party coalition that can have coherence on things like race-based policies and property rights.
Just as a final thought on this, it is always amusing to me that every centre-left and even far-left party in South Africa kind of fundamentally views itself as being in favour of major changes. We're going to change the system, but the country has been run by the left for the last 30 years. So they're actually, generally speaking, usually in favour of some kind of status quo. Which is, I think, sort of the irony of this. Anyway, let's move on to our next story. And this is, I think this relates a lot to some of the things we're talking about now, particularly with the pernicious influence of BEE. And that is unemployment amongst young doctors in South Africa. So there was this piece in the Daily Maverick by Sonhera Sukdeo. She's a young doctor. She just writes about that she, qualified with distinction in medical school, in high school, and she did her 2 years of community service that all doctors have to do by law. And she says that she cannot get a job. This despite the fact that our doctor-to-patient ratio is about 1 to 3,000, one doctor for every sort of 3,200 people. It's supposed to be closer to 1 to 1,000. She goes on to say, quote, government posts are advertised on government websites and applicants who meet all requirements are free to apply. Many of the adverts for pediatric posts, which is what she's interested in, include a disclaimer saying that the preference will be given to African males, but everyone is encouraged to apply. She never hears back from any of these positions. She goes on to finish her piece by saying, I'm a South African citizen. My family and I have worked hard to get where we are, but we are always left behind. We have doctors who are able and willing and ready to work. We have patients desperate to get the treatment that is their basic human right. We have our government failing us in every way possible. Also, it's worth mentioning she describes herself as a South African of Indian descent. I also talked to a friend of mine who is a young doctor who's currently pretty much unemployed, was doing sort of part-time assistance work about this problem, and she said it's exactly correct. So many doctors are in this position now. You'll have doctors who have good, who are specialized in courses, and they have all sorts of certifications, but these certifications have to be renewed every year, often at significant expense. And this means that it basically costs them money to stay certified, and yet they still can't get positions. Government jobs seem to be almost entirely closed to people who aren't Black for the most part. That's at least the sort of anecdotal experience. Private practices usually seem to be quite hesitant to take on new staff, and they will often just tell, older doctors will often just tell young doctors to open your own practice. But that's not so easy either, because practices are very heavily regulated. You have to deal with water outages, you have to deal with electricity outages, you have to deal with the sort of tax requirements, the financial requirements, dealing with medical aids. And all of these are things that they don't really teach you at medical school. As my friend said, they teach you, how to drain a chest. They don't teach you how to deal with all of the legalities around these things. They also are major problems with the administration of the medical system. Is that in some hospitals, in government positions, you've got these people who are essentially appointed on condition that they will finish a specialization, let's say into hearts or bowels or whatever. And they collect the salary, but don't actually ever bother finishing their specialization. And presumably either due to incompetence or alternatively something more nefarious, like maybe political or nepotistic connections, a lot of these people sit in those positions and are just never disciplined or fired or moved out, despite the fact that they're not completing their specializations, which means then that young doctors can't come in and fill those roles and are essentially kept out of the system. So it seems a lot to me, Mlondi, like the medical profession, which is, of course, a key industry in our country, it's like, when people talk about skilled jobs, skills that you want to attract or that you don't want to lose from your country, like doctors are almost always at the top of that list.
Yes.
That South Africa is really shooting itself in the foot here. And we're seeing the sort of usual concoction that has destroyed so many industries in this country of BEE plus overregulation plus political cadre deployment, appointees, that kind of thing, just wrecking the job market. Mlondi, what's your take on this? Do you agree with my assessment? What do you think?
Yes, Nick, I agree with this, like the assessment, and I think it's a really sad event, of things that are happening with regards to medical students, because they are important, and we do need, and like as the lady that wrote the piece said, that there is a shortage, but unfortunately they can't get jobs, and it's terrible, like especially in a country where we have such a high amount of brain drain. So this will also add to more brain drain. Then we'll end up not having doctors, and people will end up leaving. People who are my age and just kind of university will end up leaving and saying, so what's the point of just staying here? Like when things don't work, when we don't have jobs, so why stay? And yeah, and all that will lead to the country even plummeting more, to new lows, and we don't need that. We like we need our public services to operate efficiently, and that involves doctors. So we need to ensure that the doctors are placed in hospitals, so that also this doesn't really also affect the doctors only, but also affects the patients, because they like there already is a shortage, and then like when doctors leave, when with already a shortage, then what happens? So patients won't get treated, and when patients don't get treated, they're gonna die, and when they die, what happens? So it's all these things that that needs to be fixed, and that all stems from the government, that things up at the top are wrong, and they need to be changed, and they need to be changed fast.
Exactly. As my friend also said to me, this is why Australia and other overseas countries are so promising to doctors. Of course, doctors are in demand in many countries in the world, not just South Africa. And apparently, Australia will literally help pay you to get for your relocation costs if you're a doctor. You just then have to write, I believe, one medical exam in order to make sure that you're compliant with their rules. Which, when we're up against that kind of competition, we need to really start worrying. Herman, what do you make of this?
I think it is important to, at this stage, just remember that it was only about a year or two ago when it was disclosed in Parliament based on an opposition, I think a DA question, that more than 200 Cuban doctors were being paid in the area of, and some engineers as well, were being paid by the South African government in the area of 310-ish million rand to work. So just to put that into context, that this is the same government that would rather employ Cuban doctors than make it easy for South African doctors to actually ply their trade. Now, when it comes to skills become economically value add when I think there are three conditions met. Skills can be developed, they can be monetized, and they can be sustained. If you can develop your skills, monetize your skills, and sustain your skill set as technology and processes and methods improve, then skills become an economic asset. Short of that, skills aren't really an economic asset. If we then analyze what monetize means, I would say it consists of primarily, is the infrastructure there for, is the socioeconomic context there for you to actually ply your trade? Do you have the necessary, access to market, goods, electricity, water? And then the other component of monetization is you need a reliable consumer base. If you have the infrastructure and a reliable consumer base, I think you can get to monetization. If we look at this recipe for skills to be developed, to be monetized, and to be sustained, the government is doing the opposite of what is needed on each of those points. In terms of medical skills development, are we making progress or not? No, we're definitely making progress. No, we're not making progress, because part of the package is that for 3 years of your life, you are going to work for the government in incredibly awful circumstances. I know people who wanted to go study medicine, but just couldn't actually cope with the fact that for 3 years, they will be living and working where the state places them, and with a lack of resources and psychological strain under that. So there's disincentives for developing medical skills. Then there's disincentives for monetizing them, in the sense that you can't rely on the infrastructure that you need, nor can you rely on a reliable consumer, because the South African consumer is under so much pressure in the best sense. And then there's the NHI, which will become the new consumer. So the monetization point is a problem. And then there comes the question of, is it sustainable? Can you actually keep up your skill set with what is demanded by the market? And part of that is the psychological factor of, I can do this another day, I can do this another week, another year. And it's almost as if on every, and this is generalized, not even medicine specifically, but on every point here when it comes to medicine, there's a disincentive from the government coming. And the problem is, just harking back to the Rise Mzansi point, it's not cadre deployment that has landed us here. It is a combination of factors, amongst them being cadre deployment. But key at the heart of this problem is the centralization of these sorts of decisions being taken by a bureaucracy that is then bloated and bereft of merit due to cadre deployment. But that doesn't stop the problem that the centralization is what disincentivizes here the development of skills, the monetization of skills, and sustenance of skills for a sensible value add proposition.
So Mlondi, when I think about solutions about how to fix this, I think maybe give doctors more tax exemptions than they might currently have. Also, at the same time, you need to start cleaning out the state system from political appointees and kind of people who are not really doing anything useful. And also that the rules and regulations surrounding opening new practices should be made easier, made much simpler, so that newer doctors can maybe start businesses of their own, start their own practices. And while government repairs the state sector, you can at least get cheaper and more available private medication in, private medicine in. Do you agree with my solution there? And what are your final thoughts on this topic?
Yes, Nick, I do agree. But you forgot one more thing. The government has to do away with the NHR policy, because that policy, if that policy was to come in now, as things stand, it'll will get worse. So that NHR policy also needs to go. Needs to go. Yeah.
Exactly. Like that's what's so crazy about this is the current state of affairs with doctors not being able to find employment is before the NHI, which makes every single one of the problems we've just talked about 10 times worse.
Yes,
in terms of how it's going to gum up the works. I believe doctors, for example, won't be able to open a practice unless the government gives them a certificate saying, yes, you're allowed to operate in this area because there's a need for you there. So, if you were hoping to operate in a certain area, well, you're first going to have to ask Big Daddy government whether he is going to allow you to do it first, which one can scarcely imagine the level of corruption and bribery that will take place in such a system. It would be horrifying. I'm sorry, Mlondi, I interrupted you. Do you have anything more to add?
No further thoughts. You actually continued with my point, so you highlighted it. So I guess that was great.
Okay, cool. All right. I think let's move on for this topic. But this is what's interesting about this problem is that it's so similar to so many other industries across the country, where you have overregulation, incompetence, political administration, and BEE combining together to, well, also with the bad labor legislation, to just destroy prospects for unemployment. And that's why we have unemployment of 40%-ish, and many services and systems across the state are failing. Oh, excuse me. All right, let's move on. So, speaking of which, let's move on to our next topic, which is about overregulation and BEE. In this case, the water system. The Water Services Amendment Bill of 2023, which is currently being pushed through the legislative process by government, will require everyone, so anyone who seeks to use water or supply water at the moment to people has to get approval from the local water authority. But government wants to add a new requirement, a licensing system, which will have to be renewed every 12 months, presumably will have some sort of fee attached to it, and will also have considerations such as BEE and affirmative action applied to the issuing of water licenses. So once again, we're creating a situation where officials, bureaucrats will be able to place another requirement on people looking to supply water, whether that be municipalities, whether that be farmers trying to feed their crops, and they can insert all sorts of wonderful little bureaucratic hiccups and opportunities to shake people down for money into the system. It's just madness. Hermann, your thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly, I think it is beyond parody, where we are now at a point where the proposed solutions for state failures is the same as what caused the state failures in the first place. If you go read this bill and you go look at what Anthony Jeffrey wrote on this, it is literally a situation where it's, all right, the state has control over water resources since 1998. There's been a mess in terms of the water provision for this. Infrastructure, provision, maintenance, all within the competence of the state. Provision at a local government level, also state-based. Now we're going to get to a point where these entities that have already been part of the state will be licensed so that they can do their job that they've been supposed to be doing for the last 20 years. If that doesn't happen, the state can issue a directive to itself that must be followed to improve the failures, and the directive will then indicate the extent to which the problems ought to be fixed. If that doesn't happen, what's the wonderful fail-safe? The minister can take over the competence of that specific water provider. So the solution to state failure was state failure, was state failure, was state failure, was state failure, and the great terminator of this chain of state failure is the minister. I mean, what can go wrong?
An ANC policymaker must have the world's smallest imagination The solution is always the same to every problem. Centralize and place more requirements. Also, we need more BE. There's not a government policy you can find in the last sort of 5-10 years that doesn't follow that exact pattern. Mlondi, can you say anything that'll make me feel better?
Yes, I'm just as disappointed as the both of you. I mean, it's regulation, and more regulation, and add BE to it, and more BE. So I mean, it just never ends. It just never ends, and it's quite unfortunate. But hopefully, things will change as a country. We have an opportunity this year to make a change where we see we need to. I mean, where we see needed. So definitely, this year presents a good opportunity for us to show that we want our change and we want it now. So please, guys, go register to vote and think wisely of who you're going to vote for.
Indeed. We are going to have, I think, one more registration weekend where people will be able to register to vote in, I'm not going to say the wrong date because I can't remember, but it's early February. So do keep an eye out
3rd and 4th of February.
3rd and 4th of February. There you go. So if it's wrong, you can blame Hermann. Very important, because these are going to be very important elections for the future of the country, for its political makeup. And they also might be, it's difficult to say, there might be low turnout elections if they follow the trend of the last ones, in which case it's going to be, your vote will count even more than it normally does as a proportion of the votes. So keep that in mind. Okay, that is, I think, all the time we have for today. This became much more of a downer than I was hoping for, but sadly, when you have such boneheaded government policy, just, stuffing up everyone's lives, what can one do but feel a little bit of despair? But nonetheless, we will keep up the show and see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.